In this unit, we're talking about bonding, and our goal is to be able to identify the type of bonding in a compound. And you know you've got it if you can use the periodic table to identify elements as metals or nonmetals. And then if you know the difference between ionic bonding and covalent bonding, and what I mean by this is know the type of elements that are involved in each and understand what's happening with the valence electrons of those elements. So there are two types of bonds that we're going to focus on, and we'll go into more detail in later videos at a later date. But today, we're just going to hit the basics. Ionic bonding is a type of bonding where one atom loses electrons and another atom gains electrons. This happens between metals and nonmetals. Remember that metals want to give away their electrons and nonmetals want to take electrons. And so when I see a metal and a nonmetal, it will form an ionic bond. And here in this cartoon, we can identify this little atom on the left as our metal because it's giving its electron away to the nonmetal, and it's going to form that ionic bond. A covalent bond is the second type of bonding we're going to talk about. Covalent means that two atoms are sharing their valence electrons. Remember, if you see the prefix co, like in cooperate, means to work together. And this type of bond is going to form between nonmetals. So a nonmetal with another nonmetal. Since both the nonmetals are trying to take electrons from each other, they end up just sharing them. And we see this in a water molecule between the hydrogen and the oxygen. They just end up sharing their electrons. And for both ionic and covalent, I can use the periodic table to help me identify the types of elements. Now, later on, we're going to get into the rules for naming and the rules for writing the formulas for ionic and covalent compounds. And we'll talk about some of the properties of ionic and covalent compounds. But before we get there, I just want to make sure that you can identify if something is ionic or covalent by using the periodic table. So this is pretty easy to do, and we're going to break it down into 3 steps. Step number 1 is to find the element by name or by symbol on the periodic table. Step number 2 is to figure out if it's on the metal side or the nonmetal side, and then label it with an M for metal or N for nonmetal. And once I get that, remembering that if I see metal and nonmetal, it's ionic. If I see nonmetal and nonmetal, it's covalent. So here's what I hope it looks like on your paper. If you get a formula like CaO, you have to go find these elements. Ca is the element calcium. It's on the metal side, so we're going to put an M above the Ca. O is oxygen. We're going to put an N above it because it's on the nonmetal side. Metal and nonmetal is ionic. Here's CO. Capital C is carbon. It's a nonmetal. Oxygen, nonmetal. Two nonmetals is covalent. And it's that simple. It's just about finding the elements and determining if they're metals or nonmetals. So remember that atoms are bonding to become more stable. When metals and nonmetals react, they form ionic bonds. When nonmetals and nonmetals react, they form covalent bonds. And right now we're using the periodic table as a tool to help us label the type of bonding. Later on, we'll get into the details, but the first question you must always ask yourself is this ionic or covalent? Because we're going to find out that the rules for naming and writing formulas is different for each one.